Hello, my name's Roisin, and Wuthering Heights is a romance. Hello friends, so I think it's time to talk about romance.
He's more myself than I am. Whatever souls are made of, his and mine and the same. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. If all else perished and he remained, I would still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn into a mighty stranger.
Because Wuthering Heights is romantic.
But what about when Cathy says Heathcliff pinched her heart to pieces? What about Cathy's racism to Heathcliff? What about Heathcliff's violence and aggression? I mean, he calls himself a murderer. This sounds really abusive and not like a romance to me.
It's a prime example of a romance novel, but it's not necessarily a love story. The term romance, as I'm talking about it today, originated in the medieval period in Europe, and the name came from the Romance languages in which a lot of these stories were originally written and then translated into English, or claimed to be translated into English to make them seem more exotic and exciting. These medieval romances were fantastic adventures full of daring feats and mythical beasts, often featuring a knight-errant off on an epic quest. They could be adapted from legends and fairy tales and altered to suit the taste of the time in which they were written. And towards the beginning of the early modern period, they began to be written more in prose and to place a greater emphasis on courtly love, which was a love defined by nobility and chivalry and faithfulness in the face of adversity. It is from these romances, filled with knights and dragons and damsels in distress, that much of our modern understanding of the medieval period springs. Later, the term romance became interchangeable with the term novel, such as in Bildungsroman or Roman à clef. And in many languages, the word for novel still comes from that original idea of a romance. Le roman in French, de roman in German, or il romanzo in Italian. And many novelists of the 18th and early 19th century preferred to refer to their work as romances, such as Anne Radcliffe, one of the most famous Gothic writers, or Herman Melville, who called Moby Dick a romance of adventure. So if I was going to be really cheeky, I could say that saying romance novel is like saying naan bread. You're just saying novel. But that is the kind of pedantry that could cause you to unsubscribe, and honestly, I wouldn't judge you if you did. Regardless, as printing became cheaper and people no longer had to keep all of the stories in their head, which was what poetry was really good for, epic poetry fell out of favour and the novel rose to prominence as a form. Enter the Romantic period. The Romantic period was an aesthetic movement that stretched from roughly 1770 to 1850, but with its peak being roughly between 1790 and 1820. Wuthering Heights was published in 1847, or right at the tail end of this period. But crucially, the events of the novel are set between 1771 and 1801, right at the pinnacle of the Romantic period. In fact, because this novel is set 70 to 40 years before it was published, it could be considered to be one of the earliest historical novels, a form which sprang from the Romantic movement with the works of Walter Scott. But that is a digression. We're talking about the Romantics here. The Romantic movement was a movement of art and music and architecture as well as literature that sprung up throughout Europe, but particularly in England and in Germany. In England, there were kind of two phases to the main part of this movement that were symbolised by 6 famous poets. The older 3, Coleridge, Blake and Wordsworth, who ended up becoming a little more conservative towards the end of their lives. And the younger cool romantics, Shelley, Byron and Keats, all of whom died tragically young of consumption, drowning and disease caught while fighting for the Greek independence. It was all terribly romantic. So this movement and these men were walking Tumblr aesthetic boards. I mean, this is what romantic really means. The Romantic movement itself was a response to earlier neoclassicism, and it rejected the cool, rational symmetry of the Enlightenment with their obsession with marble, scientifically defining everything, and the Greeks and Romans, and replaced it instead with a focus on the individual experience, the glories of the wild and of nature, and the extremes of human nature and emotion over reason, revelling in horror, terror, and the sense of the sublime. There was also a romanticisation of the medieval rather than the classical past, and a wish to return to more natural, rustic ways. They wanted to escape the Industrial Revolution and the urban sprawl, and return to the noble truth of simple, bucolic living. Sound familiar? Well, aside from being seemingly a natural part of all human societies to despise the present and prefer the past, which I think has been part of human societies stretching back at least to the ancient Greeks. I studied classics, so I know that the ancient Greeks got really angry when the alphabet was introduced because they thought it would stop people learning poetry properly. But if you told me it existed in societies before then and outside of Europe, I would definitely believe you. This period of history threw up many famous writers and great works of literature, and was the artistic period in which the Brontes cut their teeth, the artistic milieu in which they learned to write. And this interest in horror, drawing up the ghosts of the past, this exploration of nature, human and animal, and medieval setting, all comes up most prominently for our purposes in the Gothic novel. Novels set in castles and monasteries and old homes that draw on ideas of the supernatural and even are often famously written by women. The Gothic novel is sometimes considered a subset of Romantic literature, one we can see has a huge impact on Wuthering Heights and the ghosts that haunt her. So now we all know what the Romantic is and what we mean when we say 18th and 19th century novels are romances, let's talk about Wuthering Heights. For the Romantics, nature and the elements were everything. From nature alone, the Romantics attempted to derive feelings which had been previously organised in a supernatural Christian framework. On top of this, the Romantics were turning away from Enlightenment reason and back to the physical nature around them in order to find divinity. You may also have heard that in the novels of the Brontes, the wild North Yorkshire moors are as much a character as any of the others in the plot. And the wildness of this untamed northern moor contrasts with the neat, controlled gardens of southern writers like Austen. Pathetic fallacy, or the use of the weather to reflect the tone of the scene and the emotions of the characters, is used throughout Wuthering Heights. Even in the name, nature and place are centred, because Wuthering is a Yorkshire dialect term meaning strong winds. And we are told in the narrative the place is named for the atmospheric tumult to which the station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure, bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times indeed. One may guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the end of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving the arms of the sun. This small detail, the name of the novel and its setting, places us in the wild north and shows us that we can expect a wuthering, a wild tempest of a novel. And the novel's natural elements are the perfect complement to the main characters in the novel. Catherine and Heathcliff's tumultuous relationship reflects the weather at the Heights. There are other similarities between the main characters and nature as well. Heathcliff, like the unforgiving landscape of the novel, is often violent and unforgiving. Catherine is as changeable as the weather with her unpredictable moods. Nature in Wuthering Heights is almost frightening, and it allows us the feeling of the sublime, that we are small and awestruck in comparison to the size and changeability of the weather. Outsiders, people from the civilised world of the Enlightenment like Mr. Lockwood, are confounded by and do not understand the weather. He becomes trapped at Wuthering Heights by a snowstorm he does not expect and thinks will blow over quickly, whereas Heathcliff, Joseph and Hareton know the truth, that he is trapped. And returning to Thrushcross Grange in such weather gives him a fever which confines him to bed, and when he recovers, determines him never to return to Wuthering Heights again. In contrast to him, Heathcliff and Catherine run out on the moors in all weather as children, exhilarated and delighted by the wilderness of it all. And Heathcliff's final ferocious happiness, his meeting with the ghost of Cathy, happens from walking out on the moors in the middle of a storm and dying with the window open and the heavy rain falling inside the Heights. Spoiler alert. And this extreme of nature is reflected in the extremes of emotion the characters in the novel experience. The novel is almost one extended example of pathetic fallacy. The Romantics believed deeply in emotion and imagination over reason, and for a romantic novelist, creating an extreme emotional reaction in the reader was equally important. The strong adverse reaction of critics at the time shows that Bronte did just that. Graham's Lady magazine wrote, "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." And the enduring power of the novel testifies that it is provoking extreme emotions in readers even today. On top of this, Gothic and Romantic writers wanted work that explored the psychological extremes of the human experience. and that was strongly concerned with interior mental processes. All of the characters of the novel who are insiders to Wuthering Heights experience these extreme emotional reactions. Cathy and Heathcliff's passion for one another, which I quoted at the beginning of this video, and which is often used when making the case for this being a great love story, is only the most famous example. But they are not alone. Hindley Earnshaw's drunken rages, which causes him almost to murder his own baby son unless Heathcliff had intervened. His emotions are described by Nellie Dean as: "He neither wept nor prayed. He cursed and defied, execrated God and man, and gave himself up to reckless dissipation. The servants could not bear his tyrannical and evil conduct long." And the disastrous romanticism of Isabella Linton leaves her to believe that Heathcliff could care for her, despite the cruelty that he shows to her. And when her fate is revealed, her passion changes completely in the opposite direction, but does not lessen one whit, as she says, "For rather would I be condemned to perpetual dwelling in the infernal regions, than, even for one night, abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again." Even the vicious tantrums of Linton Heathcliff, who cares for absolutely nothing above his own comfort, show the extremes of emotions that these characters feel. Gothic literature in particular explores the heightened emotion that comes as a reaction to trying and difficult circumstances. I find it hard to think of more trying and difficult circumstances than those that happen in Wuthering Heights in an early 19th century novel. Thomas Hardy hadn't written yet. As I mentioned earlier, the Gothic developed alongside and perhaps out of Romanticism. Scholars kind of disagree as to whether it was a development of Romanticism, a subset of that, or if it was something that just developed alongside but was its own separate artistic development. But we can see that it uses many of the same themes and ideas and is rejecting the Enlightenment and Neoclassicism in the same way. Whilst the true height of Gothic novels was much earlier than 1847, with writers like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe, and that the Gothic had been satirised to such an extent by the 1840s that it was no longer really fashionable, it clearly has such a huge impact on Wuthering Heights. As well as the obvious in the setting of a large, gloomy house in the middle of nowhere, and the constant repetition of dreams and apparitions, whether that's Nellie Dean's premonitions in dreams, or the ghost of Cathy haunting Lockwood at the beginning of the novel, the suspense and terror felt by the reader whilst reading Wuthering Heights is where the Gothic really meets the romantic. As I mentioned earlier, when Hindley drops Hareton from a great height onto a stone floor if Heathcliff hadn't caught him, but also the dread the reader feels as Catherine Linton gets closer and closer to the heights whilst on her rambles across the moor, unaware of what is waiting her there. The key characteristic of the Gothic comes not in its devices but in its atmosphere, one of evil and brooding terror. Wuthering Heights seethes vengeance. Whether it is Hindley seeking revenge on his father through his persecution of Heathcliff, or Heathcliff himself seeking revenge for his treatment by Hindley and Linton on their children, even after both fathers are dead and have no way of knowing what he is doing to them. And that, of course, is the other part of the Gothic that is really strong in Wuthering Heights. The dead walk. Yes, of course, there is the ghost of Cathy that Heathcliff is calling on to haunt him forever, but there is also the ghosts of Hindley and Linton who, though not represented on the page, clearly haunt Heathcliff's psyche. And it is Heathcliff himself who really clinches for me that this is a romantic novel. Heathcliff is a romantic hero. The Romantics were preoccupied with the idea of the exceptional figure and his passions and inner struggle. And it is Heathcliff's passions and struggles that controls the events of the novel. In the beginning, he is a young child who is shown to be bright and passionate, learning quickly, and when being bullied by Hindley, he decides to thwart him by beating him at cards and mocking him in a way that Hindley does not understand. But his troubles, his abuse and subjugation by Hindley after Mr. Earnshaw dies, his eventual being flung out into the world at the tender age of 13, his otherness as an orphan of unknown origin and his dark skin, this is the tragic backstory that builds him into an anti-hero. I mentioned Lord Byron earlier as one of the key poets of the English Romantic movement, but he was also one of the earliest celebrities. Well known as a beautiful bisexual rake, famous for his exploits with men and his seductions of women, potentially including his own half-sister, he was also known for silent rages, moody sullenness, and revenge, as well as his charm, and is believed to be one of the inspirations for the modern vampire. He was also a favourite of the Brontes. As a writer, they never met personally, and he spawned a type of character known as the Byronic Hero, which Mr. Rochester and Heathcliff himself are two of the most famous examples. The Byronic Hero presents an idealised but flawed character whose attributes include great talent, great passion, a distaste for society and social institutions, a lack of respect for rank and privilege, being thwarted in love by social constraint or death, rebellion, exile, an unsavoury secret past, arrogance, overconfidence, or lack of foresight, and ultimately a self-destructive manner. Aside from great talent, because I think Heathcliff's only real talent in the novel is for vengeance, every other characteristic is a perfect fit. He is passionate. He hates society and tells Lockwood that he would rather not see anyone ever. He hates the Lintons in part for their gentility. He and Cathy mock them for being pets, and when Linton marries Cathy, part of her reasoning is that he is a gentleman, whereas Heathcliff is not. And he has a past that is considered most unsavoury. In fact, when Isabella first meets Heathcliff, she says, "Frightful thing! Put him in the cellar, papa. He's exactly like the son of a fortune-teller that stole my tame pheasant." And her mother calls him a wicked boy, at all events. And when he dies, all they can put on his tombstone is Heathcliff and the year he died, because they know absolutely nothing else about him. And we know, of course, that he is twice thwarted in love. Cathy marries Linton, as I mentioned, and later in the novel, Heathcliff returns from his exile to find that Cathy is unwell, and he excites a passion in her, a passion for him and also an anger at the aggression between Heathcliff and Linton, which restarts her illness because she had been warned by the doctors not to get agitated, and then she dies, calling him her murderer. He is the Byronic hero taken to an extreme. He embodies both foreign and wild together. He is an outsider, a misanthrope, a passionate, rageful, injured man. And, like his inspiration, Nellie Dean describes Heathcliff thus: "Is he a ghoul or a vampire?" I mused. I had read of such hideous incarnate demons. Whether or not you consider Wuthering Heights to be a love story is up to you. I've made no arguments either way in this video. But is Wuthering Heights a romance? Is it a fictional narrative, the interest of which turns upon marvellous and uncommon incidents? That was Walter Scott's definition of a romance. And by that definition, I think we can all agree Wuthering Heights fits. But there is more to it than that. The book pushes the emotions of its characters and its readers to the extreme. It revels in wild, elemental nature, both externally and within the psychology of its characters. It plays with both the supernatural and the sublime of a Gothic novel. And its central character, its romantic hero, is modelled on the most famous romantic of all, Lord Byron. So you can tell me all you like that Wuthering Heights is not a good love story, but you can't convince me that it's not a romance. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video essay. It's the second one I've ever done. If you'd like to watch the one on Pride and Prejudice, I will leave it in the cards above. If you did like it, please like this video so that I know to make more video essays like this in the future. And if you have any ideas, any requests for books you'd like me to talk about or topics you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments. I'd love to know, as well as to discuss Wuthering Heights further with you. Thank you for watching. Please remember to subscribe if you'd like more videos like this. I put out videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, and so I will definitely see you again very soon. Bye bye! Okay, round two. I filmed this... I haven't even plugged my... Alright, round two. I filmed this whole video yesterday and went to edit it and there was no sound, so we're trying again. Probably should have put shoes on, it's bloody freezing. I wish I had Kate Bush's dry ice budget. Too close. Cathy is described as a brunette and having perfect ringlets always falling over one shoulder. So thank you, Emily Bronte, for giving us unrealistic hair expectations before Disney.